Thank you so much, Anne. That was so generous of you, that introduction. I told her to keep it short, but she never listened to me as a fellow either. Thank you, Anne. In the early 20s, I had the privilege of being at the Carter Center and the great privilege of being supervised by America's foremost public health doctor, Bill Foege, who is credited with eliminating smallpox, the only thing we've ever eliminated. And sometimes when I'm really feeling down, I'll go to YouTube and I'll listen to one of his speeches. I recommend to you that you do that because he is just a marvelous orator. And in one of his talks, he started off by saying, a philosopher once said, "He who says he hates every kind of flattery and says it with great earnest does not yet know every kind of flattery." So, you know, that was a great introduction, and I guess I feel good about it. In any event, I also want to say I love Helene Langevin. I miss her, our talks when she was in Boston. She's brilliant, as you saw when she answered that question, and she's also so modest. And it's very clear that she hits on the theme of integration. She's a great synthesizer, and she brings people together. And she's made my job easier with that segue into our topic today. And I want to thank also Madeline Becker and Amy Bauer for inviting me to be here with you today. I'll get this thing out here. Okay, our objectives today are really to focus on, I'm trying to make this bigger so I can read it. That's not going to work. All right, I'm going to have to look at this. First of all, I want to read you a quote that I think sets a tone for what we're going to try to accomplish. And this is from Geoffrey West, former president of the Santa Fe Institute. And he thinks science at its best is the search for commonalities, regularities, principles, and universalities that transcend and underlie the structure and behavior of any particular individual constituent, whether it's a quark, a galaxy, electron, cell, airplane, computer, person, or city. So as scientists, one of our jobs is to integrate, to synthesize, and to try to find commonalities. And that's really the joy of being a scientist, at least I feel that's true. We're going to focus on Engel's contribution over 45 years ago now, 1977, of the biopsychosocial model. We're going to think about it in the context of the hormetic bell-shaped curve, which seems to be ubiquitous in medicine and maybe trying to teach us something. We're going to introduce the term holarchy, which gives us a sense that as organisms, we're a system of hierarchies that interact. And we're going to think about why this may be important for our medical mission, and in particular as consultation-liaison psychiatrists, why we may be particularly well equipped to do this kind of work. And I'll also introduce another quote. Now I'm closer to my mid-70s, and I confess I enjoy reading obituaries, and the Lancet has wonderful obituaries about scientists and doctors. And this one recently was about Gregor Henderson. I didn't know the man, but he apparently was a really great public health doctor in the UK. And writing about him, McPherson says, Henderson believed it was not fair and not right to let people become unwell and to only support people's mental health when things have become unacceptably bad for them. Instead, Henderson took a field that was not a priority in either mental health or public health and persuaded people from both public health and the world of clinicians that this was something we should be doing. In other words, health promotion and illness prevention. And I think Helene is to be commended because she's adopted this strategy to try to help promote overall health try to prevent illness through whole person health. So let's talk about CL psychiatry and the continuum of health, which Helen was presenting. And I can't see that slide, but in any event, what I was trying to say here that after 20 years of helping to take care of severely ill patients on medical and surgical floors, as I said, I had this opportunity to work with CDC doctors for a couple of years, and they really taught me a lot about public health. And then wondering about how we might engage with the public health mission as clinicians started to pop into my head. When I returned to Boston to MGH, I thought, well, how can we do that? And it actually took the form, since at the Carter Center I was going around the world trying to focus on both physical health and mental health. We started a global division named after the great African-American psychiatrist Chester Pierce. And we started to think about health promotion and illness prevention and how we might really enhance that in under-resourced areas of the world. You know, Vikram Patel has been doing excellent work looking how we can use lay persons to advance health promotion and illness prevention. And when you think about CL doctors, we know a lot about physiology, how the brain and body are connected. And we take that to the inpatient units mostly, but also in outpatient. And we try to help patients who are severely ill using our knowledge of how brain and body intercommunicate. And I think we have an opportunity to go way upstream and to help our colleagues in public health to promote health and to prevent illness as far as that can be done. And this slide shows that the greatest challenge we face, even after a terrible pandemic, are these stress-related non-communicable diseases. Fully 30%, as you see in that slide, are neuropsychiatric in origin, and we're neuropsychiatrists. When we're called to the bedside, you know, our colleagues in medicine and surgery know something's not going right above the neck of their patient, and they're asking for a brain doctor. And that's what you all are, you're brain doctors. You help our colleagues understand what exactly is making this patient make terrible decisions. And you try to help that patient and the team to carry on and bring that patient back to some semblance of health. You see on that slide on the far right where the resources go. The resources overwhelmingly go to patients who are already severely ill. And there's just a tiny sliver at the top focused on public health. And okay, we will spend gazillion dollars trying to keep severely ill patients alive. And that's right, and that's moral, and that's just. However, we also have to pay attention to how we can go upstream to help prevent people from suffering so much. Okay, I'm going to speed along here because I want to drill down into a bit about what whole person health might really mean on that physiological level. But George Engel deserves a lot of credit because when all is said and done in 1977, he really didn't have the science to back up what he was saying. Remember, there was no epigenetics back then. People were still writing books, heredity versus environment, nature versus nurture. They don't write those books anymore, right? Because we know that the environment and heredity are interconnected. Okay, you can segregate, but you also have to integrate. And we'll talk a little bit about that if I don't run out of time in a moment. So, but Engel did intuit that you have to include all of these sectors, all of these dimensions, if you're going to really provide for the health of your patients. And I won't focus on this slide because Helen did such a good job, but whole person health really encapsulates so many of the movements we're seeing around us. You know, whether we're talking about lifestyle medicine, as Helene mentioned, or psychosomatic medicine, remember that term, or integrative medicine or functional medicine, mind-body medicine, the kind of stuff that we do. They're all kind of focusing on Engel's biopsychosocial spiritual approach to healthcare. I mentioned the term Holarchy, and this comes actually from the writer Arthur Koestler in The Ghost in the Machine. And he's trying to point out that beings are made up of semi-autonomous subwholes or parts that are linked in the form of a hierarchy, a holarchy. And the word health comes from the German Health, which means whole. And WHO recognizes this. A classic article now from 2021 in Cell on the hallmarks of health recognizes it as well. And so now introducing some physiology, the concept of stress arousal. For me, as Elaine intimated, for me, stress really is what the brain does to itself and the rest of the body when it's facing a separation challenge. You can only understand that when you take an evolutionary view, but I think it's true. And we try to find attachment solutions for our separation challenges. And that's our response to stress arousal. Now, the very colorful figure on the right is the famous Yerkes-Dodson curve, or Yerkes-Dodson law. Two psychologists, Yerkes and Dodson, in the early 20th century, put this on the map. And basically, what it's showing us is that life is stress. So an hour or two before you wake up, your cortisol bumps. It's because you as an organism know that you're going to be facing life when you wake up. And the slide is meant to depict the fact that when you wake up, you're kind of slow until you get a couple of cups of coffee in you. You're not at your peak. You're not performing at an excellent level. You drive to work, your boss has a series of things he wants you to accomplish. They're achievable within the time allotted to you, so it's tolerable, and you're starting to be at your peak, okay? However, we all have a limit to our peak, and that's what this biphasic curve is trying to tell us. And of course, the pandemic brought this into broad relief. It's happening all around us, but we know that we, physicians, perhaps among the most resilient population on the planet, started to fall down. And the word burnout became on everyone's lips. And that orange and red part of the curve are teaching us that we all are susceptible to burnout if we wind up in what we call toxic stress, which is persistent, overwhelming stress. And allostatic loading. So this has its origins in brain evolution. And when you think about a living organism, every living organism you can name performs 4 operations. Okay, we sense our environments. We have an apparatus that allows us to analyze the incoming data, and we affect a motor response, whether to approach or to avoid, mobilize or immobilize. Every living thing does those 4 operations. Over evolutionary time, natural selection kind of said, okay, those who have the variations to create a separate organ to do those 4 things, they're really going to have a leg up in the selective environment. And voila, a brain was born. Okay, and so think about that when you evaluate patients, right? We evaluate the sensory system going through the thalamus in terms of the external environment. We evaluate the cortices, the analysis effector part of the brain, and we analyze the primary motor cortex and the basal ganglia to see what's going on with the motor system. But the brain encapsulates those 4 operations. And when we are stressed, that system starts to fail. Now, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Len mentioned Paul MacLean. I had the opportunity to spend some time with him at the Brain Evolution Lab, and he wrote this to me about the most painful mammalian condition, separation. And he knew everything about brains. from fish brains to lizard brains to squirrel monkey atlases, which he did, and so on. And that's what he came down to. And mammals have a certain part of the brain that other organisms don't. And it's that area, the paralimbic cortex, as Maslow calls it, the anterior cingulate, the medial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex. And that's where our attachment resides. It's a node, which is a transmodal zone for that. We need that because that's our survival strategy, and we make decisions based on parental social attachment and so on. There's just a recent article about 6 versions of human love. Parental love and social love and pet love and nature love. And sure enough, it exists on a spectrum, and the most intensity comes in the brain reward motivation circuitry with headwaters in that anterior cingulate and so on. And so Paul MacLean is really a hero in our understanding of the human organism. And then, of course, Bowlby, the psychoanalyst, psychiatrist from the UK, taught us about attachment theory. And you can tie physiology then to attachment theory. And we know that from the epidemiological data about what really bothers human beings. This is the famous life stress unit scale. And 9 of the first 11 things that bother us are separation challenges. And so the ACC is very important for the attachment solutions that we try to enhance. And we do that for 4 attachments: metabolic energy, food, sexual objects, because we're sexual reproducing vertebrates, parental and social objects, and future objects, because you have this ability of prospection to look ahead. When we're separated from these attachments, we feel stress. And this is what occurs. Our stress arousal goes off the charts, and we have to start thinking about Cannon's homeostasis, right? Fight, flight, freeze response, hypersympathetic tone, et cetera. And we also have to think about allostasis, Sterling and Eyre and Bruce McEwen, their work about the metabolic wear and tear it takes to predict these separation challenges and to apportion energy to the right place. That's the feed forward of allostasis, which adds to the feedback of homeostasis. And then we introduce this fairly new term, hormesis. It's not really new. German researcher Hugo Schultz put it on the map in the middle 1800s, but it's been rediscovered by someone who's become a friend, Ed Calabrese at UMass Amherst, and others. Matt Matson at NIH is a leading proponent. And this is all about this biphasic inverted U-shaped curve, which Yerkes and Dodson picked up on. But it exists everywhere. Let me give you one example. In 2024, a paper came out about carbon monoxide and why smokers may have a leg up in terms of Parkinson's disease. It's because a little bit of carbon monoxide benefits your dopamine neurons. Those of you out there who, a patient comes in, carbon monoxide poisoning, you immediately get the MRI to see whether the globus pallidus has really crapped out, right? That's too much carbon monoxide. And it's the right side of that Yerkes-Dodson curve I showed you. A little bit is the left side. So it's hormesis staring us in the face. Okay? And unless we pay attention to it, I think we're missing the boat about what goes into making the human being human. And this all goes back to this wonderful work that really comes to us from trying to understand those poor people with PTS and PTSD. And this is the work of Kerry Ressler. And really what Kerry Ressler is showing here is that the more highly evolved prefrontal cortex, the paralimbic cortex, that part of the heteromodal cortex in the prefrontal area, evolved to do a better job than the ancient hippocampus in dampening amygdalar tone. And your amygdala, which it was designed by evolution to be a threat monitor, is going to look at everything that's an anomaly in your space, everything that seems out of place as a potential danger, okay? And it's going to ignite. It's the central, and remember, the amygdala is not a monolith, but the central amygdala's job is to put out glutamate, to awaken us to potential threats. But you have evolved this prefrontal cortex that Kerry points out here in that blue and purple region as a way to say to the amygdala, chill out, we've got this. This is not that novel. We know how to maintain our attachments. This is not going to separate from all that we love and need. So chill out. You don't have to put all that energy into your sympathetic nervous system through the lateral hypothalamus and then the locus ceruleus and get everybody jazzed up. You don't have to pour out so much cortisol through your HPA axis. You don't have to start a brush fire with your innate immune response, because we're going to be fine. It's mostly your left hemisphere saying that, right? Your right hemisphere is all jiggled up and worried. So in any event, that's where it's all happening. That's the playing field in which this football game is being played. And our job is to try to help that area of highly evolved brain do a better job. Of course, we're always running into our colleagues calling us for people with frontal network syndrome, where emotion regulation is really poor. And we're trying to pull things out of our hat to try to enhance those frontal lobes of those poor people who are suffering with the degradation of the prefrontal cortex. But that's not all. You know, we evolved in a really dirty microbial environment. So that means evolution says the people with the variation that gives them a hair trigger innate immune response, they're the ones I'm going to favor. And you have it. That has been bequeathed to you as well, for better and for ill, right? So that's another thing. In addition to managing the acute stress response and trying to make it, not let it become chronic, we have an acute phase response, an innate immune response that's great when it's acute, but we have to try to dampen it so it doesn't become chronic. Unfortunately, too many of us and our patients have a chronic inflammatory response. And that becomes an inflammatory bias for human beings that goes along with the social stress bias that we have. But it's all evolutionary. And that's why, years ago, Jeff Flyer wrote something in the New England Journal that, why don't we teach evolutionary biology in medical school? It's so central to what doctors are all about. Anyway, now I want to point out that when you drill down, and this is really important for us, although hasn't been nailed out scientifically, but we now know that in our cells, and I'm going to focus on the immune cell for the moment, there's this enzymatic system called the CGAS STING system. And it's a cyclic AMP, GMP synthase, a stimulator of the interferon gene system in your cytosol. And what happens is you have these pattern recognition receptors, and microbes, bacteria and viruses, have the antigens to attach in what are called pathogen-associated molecular patterns and set in motion this system, which eventuates in the production of these very energy-expensive pro-inflammatory cytokines. We know that. That's all well and good. That's part of that system I was just talking about, the innate immune response. And it keeps us alive. It's a shotgun sort of system that keeps us alive. But here's the kicker. We also know, right, that excessive toxic stress, if left to continue, is going to cause oxidative stress. And in that oxidative stress, mitochondria get really pissed off. And they find it harder and harder to metabolize oxygen and glucose, the electron transport chain, all that stuff you remember. And so oxidative stress leads to the overproduction of reactive oxygen species. And then what happens to the mitochondrial membrane? It becomes more porous. And then what happens? Mitochondrial DNA fragments leak out into the cytosol. And what happens? Because remember, evolution, endosymbiosis, those mitochondria are really ancient bacteria, and their mitochondrial DNA is read by the same system that's looking at virus and bacterial antigens as foreign, as something to respond to. So that's why I say, if this holds up, and I'm trying to get some people at MGH to study this, Matthias Narendorf is a brilliant researcher on leukocytes. If this holds up, we have an answer to what Helene so effectively presented as a history of the human race in terms of the mind-body connection, right? Because when you're in toxic stress, your mitochondria know about it, and they engage with the same system that is trying to protect you from foreign threats. So think about the power of that and how important it's going to be. And we already kind of know it. If you look at that figure on the right, that's showing you about the responses to long COVID. And in long COVID, the most severely ill patients had an enormous C-gas sting response in their macrophages and neutrophils. And led to cytokine storm, right? That killed a lot of people. But we're now also finding out that the patients with long COVID also have an elevated C-gas sting response. And so when you read papers now on long COVID, and they say, wow, yeah, maybe this is due to a viral sort of reservoir that continues to engage this system and produce C-gas sting and pro-inflammatory cytokine outpouring. But you also read, when you're looking at the psychometric data for long COVID, wow, there's a lot of anxiety and depression in those patients too. So this is, I think, going to be more important for us in psychosomatic medicine or CL psychiatry. And of course, there's a lot, I'm going to skip this slide, but you know that stress and metabolic syndrome is extraordinarily important. And toxic stress leads to changes in that system I mentioned, that the hippocampus suffers dendritic atrophy, the prefrontal cortex suffers with dendritic atrophy and and reduction in synaptogenesis and neurogenesis and synaptic functioning, and the amygdala seems to increase in activity. And of course, we're dealing all the time with patients who have adverse childhood events, and they come to us with toxic stress, and all of these systems we've been talking about physiologically are affected. And we know that they're vulnerable to so many stress-related non-communicable diseases, including all of our diseases. This is a slide from my friend, Martin Picard at Columbia, who's a mitochondrial expert, and he sees in every mitochondria, your cells have hundreds of thousands of mitochondria, depending on the tissue in which they reside. He sees mitochondria as little living organisms that are responding to stress pretty much exactly the way you and I are. And that's a pretty powerful sort of way to look at it, and you can look at that slide and you can see that that's basically the take-home message. This slide shows you, I reproduced that Yerkes-Dodson, but you look at the reactive oxygen species story, and it's all hormesis, right? So when you're in tolerable stress, the reactive oxygen species that sop up the excess electrons that the mitochondria is producing out of the electron transport chain are good for you. But what happens when you're in persistent and overwhelming stress? You produce too much, and then your cells rust out, okay? That's a hormesis effect. There are lots of intersections because of evolution between inflammation and stress. But, you know, we can just point out that one we just talked about in terms of C-gas sting. And then you also have been talking, I'm sure, with your trainees about the indolamine 2,3 dioxygenase system and what's going on in the inflammatory cell in a feedback way where you're producing less tryptophan out of those cells. And that may set you up for most of those depressed patients that you see on CL with medical depressions, as well as many of those patients when kynurenine gets transposed into kynuric acid, into quinolytic acid, vulnerability to delirium if that system goes on too long. There's a vulnerability to cloet and others, this 3-hit model. We all have genetic endowment, genetic vulnerability. Epigenetically, our early environment is extraordinarily important for which genes get turned on, which get turned off. And then that's going to play a role later on in terms of your phenotypic vulnerability, your phenotypic plasticity that's going to lead to the third hit, which we often see, whether it's a physical illness or a psychological trauma, et cetera. A couple of very interesting kind of studies. One focused on PET MRI, where if you do PET MRI on patients with an elevated amygdala activation, you better hope that it's balanced with a medial prefrontal cortical activation. Because if it's not, amygdala activation through sympathetic drive on beta adrenergic receptors in bone marrow creates an outpouring of white blood cells, a myelopoiesis of macrophages and neutrophils. And lo and behold, you can prove this on PET MRI with arterial inflammation, so that major adverse cardiac events in the heart-mind connection is crystal clear when you look at these scan results. And we know PTSD is a great example of this. And so not only will you see the cardiovascular and other NCD problems out of this kind of system, but Ahmed Tawakol, the lead researcher, told me last week that you also see DVTs. We talked about, you probably see pulmonary emboli. So think about those patients you're seeing on the wards who are more prone to DVTs and pulmonary emboli now. I think of catatonic patients, right? How much stress they're under and how that system is probably playing a big role. I also have the figure on the right of the slide is the epigenetic clock idea. And when you do Grimm age, you can also see that advanced biological aging is also part of this whole story. Maunder at the University of Toronto has really helped us by looking at insecure attachment and what we face every single day in CL psychiatry. So this is of great pertinence, this whole physiological story we've been sharing. But I think you can build stress resilience. That's what we try to do at the Benson-Henry Institute. But all over the country and the world, people are finding different ways. It's not, as Herb Benson, another mentor of mine, who is graciously mentioned by Helene, taught us, we're not discovering anything new. Every culture knows this. So in China, they do Tai Chi, right? Or Qigong. Or in India, of course, yoga meditation. And Tibet, mindfulness meditation. And then Dr. Benson and John Kabat-Zinn were pioneers of bringing it to the Western world. So we incorporate that with what we now know about resilience, and we try to reduce the numerator toxic stress and build a denominator resilience. And we think we're reducing vulnerability to those stress-related NCDs. And we see changes in the brain when we do neuroimaging. We also can see epigenetic changes as well. We can see in terms of primary and tertiary prevention, cardiac rehab is the best example of that. And you see significant changes in mortality. But adding mind-body to nutrition and exercise gives you a higher octane for helping patients status post-cardiac events. We're doing work at McCants using a brain care score with different sectors, and we can show a reduction over 15 years using the UK Biobank in risk for stroke, depression, and dementia if you put these principles into effect. And now I'm going to switch ahead. Been doing work with Roderick Wallace at Columbia, who's this brilliant computational psychiatrist who's written a couple of books about computational psychiatry, because he feels that you can, let's see, did I go? You can build a mathematical model associating the different inverted U-shaped curves, and we published a paper in Biosystems on this. And he did all the mathematics, I don't really know. But basically, you look at all of these curves that show up in the literature, from the mitochondria all the way to the person. And it's all hormesis. So I'm seeing that I have to get the heck off of here. But the point is, you can see this even with excitatory-inhibitory balance. And I'm going to skip ahead. And we're convinced that you can do something to help your curve. And that's where all of this whole body health, whole person health comes in. You can extend that peak in the inverted U-shaped curve by employing some of these strategies that we're talking about. And there's a whole list, I'll let you read them, of pertinences for us in CL psychiatry of this. Collaborative care and outpatient, the work of Lydia Schwastak, who's going to be talking to you, Paul Chesnowski from the University of Washington with Wayne Caton as their mentor, and of course Jeff Huffman at MGH has picked up on that. There's a lot you can do in collaborative care to do primary and secondary prevention as well as tertiary prevention. And I'll just end with the work of Robert Putnam, who basically, this is from his new book, Upswing. You know, he wrote Bowling Alone. And yes, there's a biphasic inverted U-shaped curve for the whole shebang. You can, economy, politics, politics may or may not be on your mind these days. But basically, you can plot that along the decades, and you can see when there's hyper-individualism, everything starts to suffer. Whereas a communitarian attachment solution, things start to work better. But that's what natural selection may be trying to tell us. And we turn a deaf ear to it at our own risk. These are people who get it. Spain, the floods, people lining up to try to help. This is another slide of a family that got caught in a riptide, and these people on the shore, this was down the road in Florida, Panama City. They formed a human chain to try to get those poor people, a son and his father who got caught in a riptide. So this is where it kind of starts, when our mothers look at us with love and want to take care of us, a big attachment solution. We scientists try to figure out how to help people find those attachment solutions. And that guy, the doctor of that famous painting, is struggling to try to give that child back to his parents and make their toxic stress go away. And there are some references. So, I guess I should stay here.